Greetings! Today we're going to be talking about Linux. What is it and who's it for? This is going to be an intro into Linux, and hopefully I'll keep it a little short. So Linux at its core is a Unix-based operating system. And what that means is that it shares a lot of functionality and a lot of the same features that Unix does. And so what's Unix? Well, Unix is the first true modern operating system. It was created back in the 60s, and it works off the premise of having a true multi-user experience. And so what that means is back in the 60s you had mainframes, and these mainframes would be like in the basement of colleges and universities as well as government centers, and those mainframes would have dummy terminals on your desk with a single serial cable connecting your dummy terminal, which was literally a monitor and a keyboard, down to the mainframe actual system, so basically a server. And so with this setup, what it forced a lot of computer developers and computer scientists at the time to do was literally have a single user on the server at a time. It didn't allow for multiple people to send commands to it. And so they invented Unix, and Unix allowed for this to happen. Unix also made it so that you could run the same software and the same operating system across multiple pieces of hardware, because up until Unix, you had an operating system built specifically for that piece of hardware. So it would be like if I built a custom PC today and I had to write my own operating system specifically for that processor, that motherboard, that, those specific USB ports on the motherboard, that video card on the motherboard, all of these various things, and I had to do that specific. So that's really where the unifying idea of Unix comes from, is it's a true multi-user platform, but it's also a generic platform that can run on multiple systems at the same time. It was one of the first of its kind. So back in '91, Linus Torvalds decided, I really like this operating system called Minx, which was designed around the concept of a semester-long class being able to be taught and students to be able to understand the design of Unix operating systems inside of a single semester. So it was designed specifically to be simple, but still have those paradigms of multi-user, multi-hardware platform with which to operate. And so he was like, well, I want to make edits to it. And the guy that wrote it wouldn't license him to write changes to it, make modifications. And so Linus decided, I'll make my own kernel, I'll make my own operating system, I'll do this for myself and do what I want and make the changes that I can't make in Unix. Because for many years, up until that point in time, Unix was a licensed operating system, just like Windows is today. You had to buy X number of licenses for X number of machines and so forth and so on. And there were very few open source versions of it, which there eventually became some out of Berkeley, I believe in California, correct me if I'm wrong, and that became the FreeBSD, NetBSD, OpenBSD, the BSDs, basically, that we see available today, and those are true Unix platforms as opposed to all the Linux platforms. Now with Linux, you've got distros. What a distribution is, and that's what distro is short for, is distribution. What a distribution is a specific flair of Linux. So you take the Linux kernel, and then you put whatever operating system you want on top of it. Which sounds really weird because we are constantly hearing that Unix or Linux, is the operating system or whatever. I'm like, well, in the case of Linux, there is a differentiation between the operating system itself and the kernel. The kernel can be used regardless what your operating system is. as far as Unix derived operating systems or Linux derived operating systems are concerned. So if I take Ubuntu and I install that, then I can sit there and say, well, I want to run kernel version 3.0, or I want to go up to the bleeding edge and do an unstable kernel version, and I can get that off linuxkernel.org. And I can download that and install it on my machine and see what happens. So the kernel is completely separate from the operating system in Linux. Now granted, you do have to have a Linux kernel to run a Linux operating system because there are hooks involved for how the operating system is built to communicate with the kernel. You need a Linux kernel. But that doesn't mean that you can't run new versions of the kernel or old versions of the kernel on the same operating system. But back to distros. So with distros, it's a specific version of what they think Linux should be. So Ubuntu is made by Canonical, which is a South African company, and they believe they took the Debian-based operating system concept. So they use Debian.deb packages, so Debian packages, and they really take a lot of the Debian source code and then they put their own flair on top of it. And in the last couple of years they have created and refined a desktop version or a desktop environment called Unity that they really like. I'm not a terribly large fan of it, but at the same time, it is what it is. My preferred desktop environment is GNOME. I got introduced to Linux under Unity, and then I got introduced to GNOME 3, and that's just kind of the one that I like the best. Now, I also like i3, and these are just a bunch of different desktop environments. And what a desktop environment is simply the graphical user interface environment that you interact with. So Windows 8 has a different desktop environment than Windows 7 or Windows 10. Windows XP and Windows 7 and Vista, they shared very similar desktop environments, even though they were technically different under the hood. But even as Windows users, you guys are used to this concept of a desktop environment. So it's not really that abstract. It's just you have never got to choose, I want XYE environment, or I want to have 5 different environments on the same machine. With Linux, you can do that because Linux is about choice. Linux, there is a glutton of choice. There's permutations of Linux distributions for years that you could just sit there and install different permutations and just run it different ways. But at the end of the day, it's all the same thing. It is Linux with the base kernel and some variant of the operating system with a graphical user interface. Now, for those of you that want to run the server version, that generally speaking is the same Linux distro, just without the GUI installed. They normally will not give you that opportunity. Like if you install Ubuntu's server version, you're doing that and they do not install anything extra. It is literally base configuration of Ubuntu with a Linux kernel and nothing else. You log in to a terminal user interface, and if you don't know the terminal commands, you're sunk. But they do that very specifically because they figure if you're running a server, then you already know what you're doing. So today we're going to be installing Ubuntu GNOME 16.10, but we'll be doing that in another video. So, but with Linux, it is all about choice. You get to choose what software you want, and you get to install it or remove it as you see fit. There's no hiding, there's no obfuscation of what Linux is doing. It just does what it does, and you get to sit there and see it. So one of the things that you'll notice with Linux is that everything is a file and a folder. Even folders are technically files to the Linux operating system. And that's just kind of one of the interesting things about it. And because of that, configurations are files. When you interact with a GUI and you go into a management panel, like the control panel or the Linux equivalent of it, and you make a change, it's literally calling a command line command and making an edit to a configuration file for you so that you don't have to know what that configuration file is and what the command is to run that from the terminal or open up a text editor and find that spot in the file and configure it yourself. They simply do that with a graphical user interface. But it's also one of the things that leads me into who is Unix and Linux for. Now, Linux specifically is for computer scientists, IT professionals, and programmers. And what do I mean by that? Quite simply, if you want to be a computer scientist, they're constantly using Linux. One of the reasons for that is they can put Linux on as many machines as they can get hardware for, and they're perfectly okay. There's no contracts, there's no licensing, there's no crap. They can just build their stuff to run on Linux, and it will run basically on every version of Linux that they can put their hands on. And because it's open source, they can make tweaks to the operating system to customize it for the purpose of what they're trying to do, which makes for a very interesting setup when you're looking at it from a computer scientist standpoint of I'm trying to figure out this problem. At the same time, it's for IT administrators because over 80% of the World Wide Web, the sites that you go to, run on Linux servers. So if you're going to google.com, I know for a fact that the servers Google buys from Dell to run their website and to run their search appliances and different things, they have Linux on it. And I know that because I used to be the guy putting Linux on it and setting up the configurations before it went out to site. So I know for a fact it's running Linux. It is a heavily customized Linux specifically for what Google's trying to do, but it's Linux. Like, you're not removing that from the equation. It's still Linux at the end of the day. And so with IT administrators, it's really important to know Linux because it's great for network testing. If you're network ops, you absolutely have to know Linux. Cisco Nets, their switches is built on an embedded Linux operating system that they customize for their own uses to their own ends. And I hope you start noticing a trend here. People take a base Linux distro or a base Linux operating system and then they customize it. They make it work for what they want. Whether you're a computer scientist, whether you're an IT administrator, it doesn't matter. You have a job to be done, take Linux, customize it to specifically what you need, and then you're off to the races. It's great. Now, for programmers, one of the reasons why I highly suggest you get on Linux is quite specifically because with Linux, you can see exactly how the operating system works. You can see every little bit of it. You can see how it talks to the graphics card. You can see how it talks to the processor. You can see how your GUI applications are affecting the computer and how it's interacting with it. There is no proprietary technology here. You know, if you're using Debian or any of its relatives, I forget the specific Linux term for that, derivatives I think may be it. So you've got like Debian, Ubuntu, Linux Mint. There's a couple of pen testing distros like Kali Linux and Parrot OS. They're all Debian based. They all take the Debian operating system from the Debian guys and then they customize it to their own flair. And even within Ubuntu, there's Ubuntu with different desktop environments that have been specifically configured to work better with those desktop environments, as opposed to taking the standard Ubuntu Unity version of Ubuntu and then installing GNOME on it and having to figure out those nitpicky little configurations yourself. But whether you're doing Debian-based stuff or whether you're doing RPM-based stuff, which RPM stands for Red Hat Packaging Manager. So Red Hat Linux is a version of Linux that is built for the enterprise, that was made by Dell, and they sell out licensing contracts on a yearly basis, and it's super expensive. But there's free versions of that are open source, like Fedora and CentOS and OpenSUSE, that give you that Red Hat environment without having to pay the cost of having Red Hat. Which, if you're not running a server and you're not doing some enterprise level environment where you need customer support, go with Fedora. Go with OpenSUSE. Go with CentOS. Any of these RPM operating systems are perfectly fine. I just didn't cut my teeth on it, so I will be showing you guys Ubuntu. But there's a common trend here. And so with programmers, we need to see how particular functions work. We need to understand how the code is written. And to do that, we need to see the code. But I would argue, even beyond seeing the code, you need to use it. How much good does it do you to see Adobe Reader's source code if you've never used Adobe Reader? You have no idea what it does. You don't know what the user interface looks like. You don't know what tools are available built into it. So if you're trying to learn, or if you're trying to develop your skills and be better than what you currently are, my question is, how is looking at the code going to help you if you've never run the software? If you're trying to build an operating system of your own, how is looking at the code for an operating system that you've never interacted with, you've never dealt with, how's that going to help you? What good does that do for you as the developer? Because you may end up creating something that's total and complete crap. You never know. So that's some of my arguments on why you need Linux and who needs Linux. It's very useful to anybody wanting to write code. And I would even argue, if you're wanting to make the next Microsoft Office release, get on Linux. Learn Linux. Understand what Linux is. Because Microsoft is moving toward being Unix and Linux friendly. I mean, they've always had support for Apple's OS X, but they're becoming much more Linux friendly. And so if you want to get on that team, if you want to make Office 2018 or 2020, then you need to know what it's like to be on a team like that. And so if you're like me and you're going back, I'm going back to school. You may be going to college for the first time. But if you're wanting to learn and get into this world of programming and development and different things, you need to know what it looks like to be on that kind of a scale. And so you need the combination of understanding how LibreOffice works from a user's perspective, but you also need to sit there and look at the source code, look at the Git repository, follow the commit pushes, and really see how this worked, what it looked like as it was being built from the ground up. And so I would argue, even if you're wanting to do C# development, even if you're wanting to do some Windows proprietary language or development, or you only want to make it for Windows, and again, no condemnation for that. If you want to build for Windows, build for Windows. I would still argue that you need to know Linux so that you can A, be flexible and get better jobs to get you where you want to go, because that flexibility will open up your mind to new ways of doing things, but also you need to be on Linux to see what these teams look and feel like when you're building out such large integrated software. And so with that said, I'm going to end it here because I think I've talked long enough, and you guys should hopefully understand the basics of why you want Linux, who needs to be using it, and what it is. So I will see you in the next video. If you like this video, press the like button. If not, you know what to do. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Thank you guys, and we'll see you soon.